Tonight we begin with a development that Pentagon officials had feared, State Department analysts had dismissed, and Israeli intelligence had tracked for months. A missile test that unfolded not over weeks of diplomatic warnings, but in mere hours. Hours that shifted the balance of power in the Middle East. Hours that exposed deep fractures in American foreign policy. Hours that forced Benjamin Netanyahu to issue the most severe warning of his political career. What Iran did today crossed a line that Washington had hoped would hold through careful diplomacy and strategic ambiguity. And when that line broke, Israel did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with fury, and with a message that echoed across the entire region. But here's what made today different from every other escalation we've covered. The Trump administration, normally vocal, normally aggressive, normally first to the microphone, went completely silent. No statement from the White House, no tweet from the president, no condemnation from the State Department, just silence. And in geopolitics, silence is never neutral. Silence is a message. For several months now, there had been signals, not official intelligence briefings, not formal diplomatic cables, just signals that Iran was preparing something unprecedented. Iran has been provocative, yes, but they have been calculated in their provocations. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a predictability, almost a choreography that Western intelligence agencies had learned to anticipate. But what set off alarm bells in Tel Aviv and Washington this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Iranian military communications know the indicators: the movement of mobile launch platforms toward strategic positions, the sudden increase in encrypted communications between Revolutionary Guard commanders, the repositioning of air defense systems around nuclear facilities, the sudden evacuation of civilian personnel from military research sites. All of that went quiet. And whenever Iran goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant reportedly told his American counterpart in a classified call that the silence was more concerning than any amount of saber rattling. Sources within the Israeli defense establishment described the days leading up to the test as the most tense they had experienced since the October 7th attacks. Iran wasn't just planning another routine show of force. They were planning something that would fundamentally change the strategic calculus of the entire region. And they were doing it at a moment when they believed, correctly or not, that American attention was elsewhere. Early Wednesday morning, Israeli satellite reconnaissance detected what they described as unusual thermal signatures emanating from Iran's Shahrud missile facility, including the movement of heavy transport vehicles that had not been activated in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Iran only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: imminent launch capability, strategic deterrence messaging, or preparation for an actual strike. Intelligence analysts in Jerusalem didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they didn't know was that Iran was changing its posture. And when a regional power shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest degree, every intelligence agency in the world pays attention. Within hours, the fears were confirmed. Iran successfully test-launched what they claimed was a new generation of medium-range ballistic missile, one capable, according to Iranian state television, of carrying multiple warheads to targets across the region with unprecedented accuracy. The missile, reportedly designated the Khyber-2, traveled approximately 1,200 kilometers before landing in a remote area of eastern Iran. But the distance wasn't what alarmed Israeli officials. It was the trajectory. The test flight path was deliberately calculated to demonstrate that Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Israel's nuclear facilities at Dimona were well within range. This wasn't a scientific experiment. This was a threat letter written in rocket fuel. The warning issued by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Officials after emergency security cabinet meetings described Iran's missile test as destabilizing, provocative, and perhaps most importantly, indicative of an acceleration in Iran's weapons timeline that had not been previously anticipated. Netanyahu appeared before cameras looking visibly fatigued but resolute. His words were chosen with surgical precision, the kind of language that diplomats recognize as just one step below a formal declaration of imminent military action. "Let me be clear to the tyrants in Tehran," Netanyahu said, his voice steady, but carrying an edge that longtime observers noted was different from his usual rhetorical flourishes. Any attack on the state of Israel will be met with overwhelming force. We are not asking for permission. We are not waiting for consensus. We will defend our people with every tool at our disposal. But deterrence only works if the adversary hesitates. Iran did not. In fact, their response to Netanyahu's warning was among the most defiant we've seen in years. Here's what we know. Within 2 hours of Netanyahu's address, Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei released a statement through state media declaring that the Zionist entity's threats are the desperate gasps of a dying regime. These weren't the carefully worded diplomatic hedges we've become accustomed to. These were direct, personal attacks, the kind of language that Iran's leadership only uses when they believe they hold strategic advantage. Tonight, Israeli military sources confirmed that the IDF conducted preemptive reconnaissance operations on Iranian-linked positions in Syria, including a weapons depot near Damascus that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was the staging of advanced missile components. Israeli Air Force jets struck before Iran could complete the transfer. They hit the primary storage facility. They hit the access roads leading to the compound. They hit communication towers that were likely preparing to coordinate the next phase of weapons distribution to Hezbollah. In other words, Israel targeted the supply chain, the infrastructure that would have made the next generation of Iranian missiles operational in Lebanon. This is what made Netanyahu's warning so urgent. Iran's missile test wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of capability advancement that could fundamentally alter the balance of power if left unchecked. And Israel, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike Iranian territory directly. They didn't target Iranian military personnel. They hit the logistics network. They hit the capability, not the people. This approach serves two purposes. It degrades Iran's ability to project power while avoiding the kind of escalation that would force Tehran into a corner where their only option is full-scale retaliation. It's a calibrated response, aggressive enough to demonstrate resolve, restrained enough to leave diplomatic off-ramps open. But here's where the story takes a concerning turn. And here's where the story becomes even more troubling. Intelligence analysts now believe that Iran's missile test was specifically designed to probe the reliability of American support for Israel after months of tension between the Biden and now Trump administrations over the conduct of the Gaza war. Iran wanted to see whether Washington would respond with its usual strong condemnations, military repositioning, and explicit statements of support for Israeli security. But instead, the opposite happened. The Trump administration didn't condemn. They didn't reposition. They didn't issue the standard boilerplate about ironclad commitments to Israeli security. They went silent. And that silence was so conspicuous, so unusual, that even Iranian state media noticed. You don't get Tehran's attention easily. But today, Washington's silence did. Defense analysts speaking with multiple outlets under conditions of anonymity described the administration's posture as strategic ambiguity, a way to maintain flexibility while avoiding commitment to any particular course of action. But Israel proved today that they remain both capable and willing to act unilaterally. Their strikes on Syrian targets were not only precise, they were coordinated so effectively that Syrian air defenses never even activated. That element matters because it shows that Israel's military superiority in the region remains intact despite the resource drain of ongoing operations in Gaza. It shows that Israel is not waiting for American permission. They are acting on their own timeline. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Israel's response. The Israeli Air Force carried out at least 12 separate strike missions over Syrian territory, forcing Russian military observers at nearby installations to shelter in place. Israeli naval forces targeted a cargo vessel in the eastern Mediterranean that had been flagged by intelligence as carrying Iranian weapons components in the last 72 hours. Israeli cyber units operating from classified locations reportedly disabled communication systems used by Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps to coordinate with proxy forces in Lebanon and Iraq. This wasn't just tactical strikes. This wasn't just sending a message. This was systematic degradation. This was strategic suppression. And strategic suppression is the one thing Iran has struggled to counter since the elimination of Qasem Soleimani in 2020. For every advance they have made in missile technology, Israel has countered with something that neutralizes the advantage before it can be fully deployed. Remember, Iran thought the October 7th attacks would permanently weaken Israel's strategic position. They thought the international condemnation of Israeli operations in Gaza would isolate Jerusalem diplomatically. They thought the political turmoil within Israel over judicial reform and Netanyahu's legal troubles would paralyze decision-making at the highest levels. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Israel is unified in its response to Iranian aggression. Israel is conducting military operations with precision that rivals any period in its history. And Israel is demonstrating to the world that internal divisions do not translate to external weakness. What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous is that Iran's missile test happened at a time when Supreme Leader Khamenei is under unprecedented internal pressure. Hardliners in the Revolutionary Guard want escalation. Moderates in the civilian government want economic relief. The Iranian public wants an end to international isolation. Regional allies like Hezbollah want Iranian support for their own conflicts. Khamenei is balancing these demands while managing the most severe economic sanctions in Iran's modern history. And when leaders in that position make sudden, dramatic moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The missile test wasn't a demonstration of Iranian power. It was a desperate attempt to change the narrative, to show domestic audiences and regional allies that Iran remains a force to be reckoned with despite years of economic strangulation. But while Netanyahu issued his dire warning, the response from Washington remained conspicuously absent. The White House press office, normally quick to issue statements on major Middle East developments, said only that the administration is monitoring the situation. That is diplomatic language for, we have nothing to say, and we're not going to say it. You don't usually hear that kind of non-response from an American administration unless something serious is happening behind the scenes. Sources familiar with internal White House deliberations suggest that the Trump administration is deeply divided over how to handle the current escalation. Some officials reportedly want to use the moment to pressure Israel on Gaza. Others want to reaffirm unconditional support for Israeli security. And still others reportedly believe that American disengagement from the region is the strategically correct long-term position. The result is paralysis. And paralysis, in the Middle East, is rarely neutral. It's interpreted as weakness by adversaries and abandonment by allies. Meanwhile, Netanyahu addressed the Israeli Knesset in an emergency session, a rare, somber speech tonight. He said, "The state of Israel will not outsource its security to any foreign power, no matter how close an ally." He said, "We have learned the lessons of history. When Jews depend on others for their protection, they are never fully protected." And he said, "To the people of Iran, you are not our enemy, but your leaders have made themselves enemies of peace, and we will respond accordingly." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a government that understands just how high the stakes have become and how alone they may be in facing them. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Iran's missile test wasn't isolated. Along with the Khaibar 2 launch, Hezbollah conducted its largest drone and rocket barrage against northern Israel in over 3 months. Houthi forces in Yemen launched additional attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq increased drone operations targeting American military installations. All of this happened within the same 48-hour period. When Iran moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This isn't coincidence. This is coordination. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Iran is preparing for a larger regional confrontation and is positioning its proxy forces in advance. Another is that Iran is attempting to create leverage for a diplomatic breakthrough, escalating to de-escalate, in the classic negotiating playbook of authoritarian regimes. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Iran is attempting to test the new Trump administration's red lines before committing to more aggressive actions. But today, Israel took that card off the table. They didn't wait for American guidance. They didn't consult with Washington before striking. They didn't request permission or seek consensus. They acted unilaterally, decisively and effectively, and in doing so, they sent a message that American silence would not translate to Israeli paralysis. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Iran wants to see whether American support for Israel has fundamentally weakened. Israel wants to show that it doesn't need American permission to defend itself. The Trump administration wants to prevent being drawn into another Middle East conflict. And the international community wants to prevent a regional war that could send oil prices soaring and disrupt global trade. All of these competing interests are colliding in real time, and the outcome will depend on decisions made in the next several days. Tonight, we've heard from Pentagon officials who are now closely monitoring Iranian military communications for signs of retaliation. They say that Iranian forces have been placed on heightened alert across the country. They say that Russian military advisors in Syria have been ordered to avoid Israeli target areas. And they say Iran's decision to conduct this particular test at this particular moment is likely part of a broader strategy intended to exploit perceived American disengagement. But Israel is not backing down. In fact, Israel is doubling down. Their response today, swift, precise, and devastating, sent a message to Tehran that provocations will be met with consequences. And it sent a message to Washington that Israel will act in its own interests regardless of American domestic politics. As the night continues, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Iran hoped to achieve with this dramatic escalation. But what we do know is that Netanyahu's warning was timely. It unified Israeli political factions that had been at each other's throats for months. It reminded the international community that Israel remains the dominant military power in the region. And it forced Washington to confront the consequences of its own strategic ambiguity. What happens next will depend on what Iran does in the next 72 hours. If they de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as a successful case of Israeli deterrence. If they escalate further, Israel has already shown they are fully prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. They have shown that American silence will not become Israeli weakness. And tonight, for the first time in months, Iran appears to be genuinely uncertain. Tehran is quiet, too quiet. And when Iran is quiet, it means they are recalculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Iran learned something they have learned many times before but seem to forget, that Israel's willingness to act alone is not a bluff, that military capabilities matter more than diplomatic positioning, and that the absence of American leadership does not mean the absence of consequences. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Netanyahu has drawn his line. Iran has been warned. And Washington's silence has consequences that neither party fully controls. And we will be here, watching every detail, as the next phase of this dangerous standoff unfolds.